We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 85 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app, which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Valerie Wayne, the art and editor of Cymbeline and a professor emerita at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash.
Jews they much more existed in the imagination. And they were much more things of an alien kind of culture. So Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, so many hundreds of years before Shakespeare's time. And they had their memory and their image had been kept alive, again, in popular culture and religious culture, but actual familiarity with Jews was pretty rare in Shakespeare's England.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
There were only a few hundred Jews living in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, and of the ones who were there, they would meet and worship in secret. Outwardly, these Jews would either have converted to Christianity or lied about their faith to keep from coming under suspicion. As callous as it seems for the nation to have been suspicious of Jews, famous Jewish people in high places like Rodrigo Lopez, physician to Queen Elizabeth I, gave the nation cause to be scared of them, as Lopez was arrested for trying to poison the Queen. Despite the suspicions around Jewish people and their faith, many Jews were employed at universities like Oxford and Cambridge during Shakespeare's lifetime as teachers of Hebrew, and even at the Bodleian Library, helping with the Hebrew collections there. In light of Shakespeare's very Jewish play, Merchant of Venice, we have our guest, Dr. Anthony Bale, here this week to help us explore the presence, reputation, and reception of Jews and characters like Shylock by the average playgoer during Shakespeare's lifetime. Anthony Bale is the Executive Dean of Arts and Professor of Medieval Studies at Birkbeck College. In particular, his work has explored relations between Christians and Jews in medieval England, and more recently, the culture of medieval pilgrimage. He has also edited and translated several medieval texts and has recently published a new translation and edition of the Book of Marjorie Kemp with Oxford University Press. His current work explores travel, books, and pilgrimage between England and the Holy Land in the later Middle Ages. Professor Bale acted as an academic advisor for the Blood exhibition in 2015-2016, and more recently, Anthony was an academic advisor to the Jewish Museum of London for its recent prize-winning exhibition, Jews, Money, Myth. You can explore this exhibit, Dr. Bale's work, and learn more in today's show notes. We're excited to be able to speak with him today. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to the show.
Hi. It's great to be here.
Did Protestant England hold Jews in higher suspicion than Catholics at this time?
That's a really difficult question to answer.
We try to start with the really tough ones, yeah.
It's not really an either or a kind of relative kind of suspicion. Catholics were part of English society, English culture, English history. They were present. There always were Catholics in England. They were often very influential. Obviously, you had the situation in Protestant England of Henry establishing the Church of England, but then the Catholic Church being re-established by Mary, and then Protestantism being re-established by Elizabeth. And so people in 16th century England, in Shakespeare's England, Catholicism was something very familiar. It was a very familiar memory. Someone like Shakespeare as a child would have been familiar from their parents and their grandparents with Catholic pre-Reformation religion and culture and myths and stories. And of course, the landscape, the dissolution of the monasteries had only happened in the 1530s and 1540s. And the kind of urban geography and the local geography would have still been very much affected by the Catholic presence. And so Catholicism was familiar. It was part of popular culture. It was part of religious culture. It was part of the national story. And the Reformation was still a very young and quite fragile thing. Apparently Elizabeth I herself, she is said to have had her own rosary and her own personal altar. And there's all these kind of hangovers of Catholicism that you can see right into the 17th century. Whereas Jews were much more existed in the imagination. And they were much more things of an alien kind of culture. So Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, so many hundreds of years before Shakespeare's time, and they had their memory and their image had been kept alive, again, in popular culture and religious culture, but actual familiarity with Jews was pretty rare in Shakespeare's England. And so when you talk about how Protestant England might have held those people in suspicion, Catholics were held in suspicion as very much the territory on which the Reformation was being established and fought, whereas Jews were a much more vague and mobile and undefined kind of thing, and could really be made into what Protestant English people wanted them to be. So that's a kind of woolly answer, but Jews are much more spirits of the imagination. Catholics are much more about the terrain of the Reformation.
So Catholics were the fear that you understood, and the Jews were under suspicion or a fear based on things that were made up, as opposed to, like, maybe there was a fear about not knowing what you were going to get.
Yes, that's one way of putting it. I mean, of course, Catholics were also part of Protestant stereotyping and Protestant satire, and lots of untrue things were said about Catholics as well. But yes, Catholicism was very much a present and familiar presence, whereas Jews were very much they were familiar from the Bible, but in terms of real...
Nobody really knew
contact.
a Jew on the day-to-day.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, or Jewish practice. Yeah.
James
Absolutely.
Shapiro wrote an article for the British Library in which he claims Elizabeth I's physician was Jewish, Rodrigo Lopez, and that he went to his death, quote, affirming that he loved the Queen as well as he loved Jesus Christ, which, coming from a man of the Jewish profession, moved no small laughter in the standers-by, end quote. Anthony, why would people have been laughing at this kind of declaration?
Okay, so first, it's really important that we unpack a little bit who this guy, Rodrigo Lopez, is. It's very easy for us in the 21st century to say he was Jewish, but his identity was actually much more complicated than that. He had been born to a Jewish family in Portugal, but he'd been raised a Catholic, or a converted Jew in a Catholic, publicly professing his Catholicism. He'd been educated at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, and the Portuguese Inquisition had already forced him to leave Portugal, and he settled in London in the late 1550s, I think in 1559. And there he joined the Church of England. So this is someone who'd been a Jew, a converted Jew, a Catholic, a Portuguese person, and a Protestant. So his identity was very mobile and very fluid.
So you are saying he was Jewish by religion, not by race?
He was Jewish by origin, and he was probably Jewish by religion to some extent, because most converted Jews in Spain and Portugal kept aspects of their Jewish belief. So they might have been as simple as not eating pork or maintaining circumcision, but they also sometimes were full practice of Judaism and secret Judaism.
Okay.
What's sometimes called crypto-Judaism. But the point is that Rodrigo Lopez's identity is not simply that he was Jewish. One of the things that would have made him an enemy to the minds of many English people in Shakespeare's England was he was also Portuguese, and Catholic. So he was a kind of perfect enemy of all the different things that people would have mistrusted and been kind of rude about at that point. So he was an easy
target.
Target. And the idea, and laughing at him professing his love of Elizabeth I, that's partly, I think, this is an anecdote. It's not necessarily something that we're absolutely certain happened, but laughing at him is a way of kind of laughing at the idea that this person who's changed his identity so many times could possibly have any fixed or stable allegiances and real, faith to Elizabeth. But the other thing I would say, just to qualify this story a little bit, is that you've got to remember as well that the crowd laughing at him being hanged is also a reflection of the very public and performative nature of execution at this point. And execution was something, it was a bit like going to the theatre. It was highly theatrical, it was highly performative, and it would have been quite normal for the crowd to participate in the execution, through shouting, through, swearing at the person being executed. And so the idea that they were doing something, the crowd was being somehow particularly horrible to Lopez, actually, I'm not sure that's true. I think the crowd often engaged with the execution.
One of the members of Raleigh's Roanoke expedition was also a Jewish man named Joachim Gauntz. Now, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly or not, but I saw that he agreed.
From Bohemia, from Prague, yes.
Okay. Yeah. He agreed to work with a Protestant minister teaching him Hebrew. So he was the Hebrew instructor for this Protestant minister, and he would ultimately be ushered out of the nation over claims of heresy resulting from his meetings with this minister. Anthony, my main question concerning Joachim's story is, why was the Protestant minister interested in learning Hebrew?
Okay, that's a great question. So what we call Christian Hebraism, so the Christian study of the Hebrew Bible, this goes back to before the Reformation and before the establishment of the Protestant Church. But even in the kind of 13th and 14th centuries, Jews and converted Jews had been in conversation with Christians about the true meaning of the Bible, because Jews had access through their knowledge of Hebrew and through their deep learning of the Hebrew scriptures to a different version of the Bible from the Latin Bible. Okay, so there's always been this kind of contact on a theological level between Jews and Christians around Bible study, and that was true in places like Bologna or Salamanca or Oxford, even before the Reformation. But this question takes on a much more political and much more urgent nature in the Reformation, because Protestant theology is all about the congregation and the congregation understanding the Bible, whereas Catholicism is a priestly religion where the priests have control of the Bible through its Latin form, and they are then able to, they explain that through preaching to the congregation. And so one of the big arguments about Hussites, Wycliffites, 15th century kind of pre-Protestantism is who can understand the Holy Scripture, who can understand texts. And so in the Protestant period, getting Jews to come and interpret the Bible, or converted Jews to come and interpret the Bible, becomes a very big deal. Henry VIII has Jews come to the English court to interpret the Talmud for him, as to try and evince evidence for his divorce of Anne Boleyn. So he can marry Anne Boleyn, sorry. And Charles II also has Jews come to his court later. There are converted Jews at Oxford and Cambridge doing theological translation. And actually, after the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, some of the Hebrew books end up being protected in universities and monasteries, so Christians can learn from. So Protestants studying Hebrew makes a lot of sense, because, of course, the Christian Bible is based on a Hebrew book. And so having better access to that is perfectly understandable.
Seems pretty dangerous for someone like Gauntz to agree to teach Hebrew. I mean, it says he was expelled from the country. Like he wasn't allowed to live there anymore I felt like they said it was claims of heresy, the article that I read.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems, one of the issues there, and this happened several times in the Middle Ages, where Jews either are accused of converting or sometimes do convert people that they're teaching, is that someone like that who is opening up a version of the Bible which doesn't include the New Testament is absolutely on dangerous grounds. And actually, in Catholic tradition, anyone who's translating the Bible, whether it's into English or Hebrew or any other language, from the sacred text of the Latin Bible, is straying into heresy. And so, yeah, absolutely. If it's in the service of Christianity, of Protestant Christianity, then that's fine. If it actually ends up leading people astray with different interpretations, then not so much.
It seems that Jews were not just regarded suspiciously in terms of potential heresy, but rather in general, while simultaneously being respected too, since, as you mentioned, they were hired at Cambridge and Oxford to teach Hebrew and serving even in the royal court as official translators and even on royal expeditions in the case of Raleigh. Yeah. Where else do we find Jews able to live and work in England, and why are they tolerated when other religions were not?
We don't really. That's the easy answer. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So after 1290 until the 17th century, there's no organized public Jewish community in England. Okay, there's nothing that we can call a Jewish community. There are individual Jews. So, for example, there's a guy who is born Eduardo Brandão, again in Portugal. He was born in Lisbon, and he came to England as a converted Jew, and he lived in the House of Converts in London, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. This was in the 1460s and early 1470s. And he eventually, as a converted Jew, became a soldier, became a knight. He was knighted by Richard III. He became the governor of the island of Guernsey. And he rose to a very influential position. But the key thing is that he was a full convert. He changed his name even to Edward Brampton, from Eduardo Brandão to Edward Brampton. So he became an Englishman. If you were happy to renounce your identity, yes, you could do that. Those cases are very unusual. In fact, almost unique. There's only a couple of similar people. In Shakespeare's London, there's two separate strands of the Jewish community. There's one strand which are Italian court Jews, usually musicians, and they come from northern Italy, and they are hired at the English court to perform for their musical skill. And they are very fashionable in what they're doing, very glamorous, and they quite quickly marry into English society and disappear more or less as a distinct community. The other community is the community that Rodrigo Lopez is part of, which is the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community, all of whom were converted to on the face of it. They might have practiced crypto-Judaism or secret Judaism, but outwardly they had converted. And they tended to be a much more coherent community, but eventually they either left in the early 17th century or they married into the English aristocracy or the English society. So Jews weren't really tolerated as Jews. I think this is a really important point to make. For there to be a Jewish community, a Jewish community that's really Jewish, there have to be a few basic things. One is a cemetery. Jews need somewhere to bury their dead. One is a synagogue. They have to have a place where they can worship. Another is to have a mikveh, a ritual bath, where ritual purity can be observed. Another is to have a community which can support things like the production of kosher food, the production of sacred books. So actually to have an established Jewish community, you need quite a lot of stability, some real pieces of land, and the cemetery has to be separate from where people live. It has to be a certain distance from where people live. And there's also the strictures on what you can wear. So, Jewish men have to they traditionally cover their head. Jewish married women cover their heads as well. Those kinds of things. all of which involve public professions of one's faith. And that is impossible in Tudor London. There is not really an outwardly public professing English Jewish community at this time anywhere in England.
When Shakespeare was 13 years old, 2 years after Dudley's proposal to Elizabeth at Kenilworth, which I mentioned for context here, John Foxe, that you mentioned earlier, famous for his Book of Martyrs, oversaw the public conversion of a Jewish man named Yehuda Menda, or is it Yehuda Menda?
He's got various names. Nathaniel Menda. Yehuda Menda. He's given various names. But yes, Menda.
Well, he was converted by John Foxe at All Hallows Church in London. And he was one of many Jews who lived in what was called a convert's house called the Domus Conversorum, there's no I, which was in existence on Chancery Lane from about 1232. Anthony, this surprised me because I had never heard of a convert's house. What is this?
Well, the Converse House is actually unique, so it's fine that you hadn't heard of it, but it's a very interesting establishment. So it's the Domus Conversorum, the House of Converts. And this was established in 1232 by the English king, Henry III. And as you said, this was on a street called Chancery Lane, which now is quite kind of in the centre of London, but then was somewhat at the edge of London. You need to think of this as a kind of monastery. A bit like a monastery, an enclosed dwelling. It was originally designed for about 50 to 70 converted Jews. And it was funded by the royal family. And the idea was that if Jews gave up their faith, then in return they got basically the support, the sustenance to live in this house of converts, which clothed them, which fed them, which kept them safe, which provided them with instruction in Christianity. Right? And then from the House of Converts, some of those Jews, then converted Jews, were then sent to monasteries. In the Middle Ages, the population of this House of Converts went up and down, and it obviously went up, not surprisingly, when the Jews were being most persecuted. And it was actually a safe haven, and a Jew could go in and say, right, I give up my faith, I become a Christian, and they were looked after.
Because in many other parts of Europe, they were kind of fleeing here, is my understanding, from what was actual physical threat to their person, like life, limb, property, all being taken from them.
And in England too. Okay. Now, after 1290, the House of Converts stayed. It existed. It continued existing because there were still converts living in it. And in 1308, so 18 years after the expulsion, there were 17 men and 17 women living in it. It had become much smaller, but these are all Jews who remembered the Jewish community that had been expelled. Now, what's really surprising is that the House of Converts actually carries on until the 18th century as a place for converts. It's not just Jews. You mentioned Roanoke earlier, and actually in 1605, there was a Native American called Arthur Anto, living there. And he said he was a pagan who had been taught the Christian faith. But it was mainly for Jews. And then in the 16th and 17th century, you get a few Jews, like this guy Menda, Nathaniel or Yehuda Menda, coming into the House of Converts. The number of people there is very small. And actually the chapel there became the Converts Chapel, which had been the church for the converts, became at some point the storage for the records from the Court of Chancery, and eventually this whole building became the Public Record Office, which it was until I was here, until the 1990s, and then it moved to the whole building moved to Kew outside London, which is where it is now as the National Archives. So it's actually a very important building in the history of England. And the footprint of the House of Converts is still there. It's now part of the library at King's College.
Would Shakespeare have gone there to get his history of the Jewish faith for things like Merchant of Venice?
He could have done, but no, probably not. And there's no reason. I mean, he may have done. I mean, who knows? But no, I think probably not.
Very important building, very important for the history of England, but Shakespeare would have passed it by.
It depends if you think it was important or not for Shakespeare to meet a converted Jew. I don't think that's how he worked.
I do think in The Merchant of Venice, he portrays Jewish faith and culture accurately, at least in some aspects. Where would he have gotten that information if not from meeting with some of the Jews who were in London?
I mean, he could have got that from lots of written sources. He could have got it even from other plays. He could have got it through talking, through his school education, through Christian sources. If a good Christian would have read the book of Leviticus, would have read the Hebrew Bible in English. So I don't think they would be very familiar with things like the Psalms. I don't think it's that surprising.
Okay.
But he might have been familiar with the House of Comfort.
With the Jewish faith being imaginary for a lot of people or only known through reading the Bible, I guess then the question becomes, does Shakespeare's portrayal of Jews in The Merchant of Venice only stick to what you can know from the Bible, which may be a much bigger question than we can answer today?
No, absolutely. I mean, Jews have always existed in the Christian imagination. As I said, they are part of Christianity. Judaism is the foundation of Christianity. The Old Testament is the old to the Christian new. But at the same time, the other thing that would have been familiar to Shakespeare are more mass culture representations of Jews, which he would have known through things like ballads, which kind of songs. He would have known through saints' cults. He would have known through popular images, paintings on church walls, stained glass. He would have known through preachers' stories. All these things are kind of saturating the English consciousness, and often they are very anti-Semitic, very negative. They're much more the kind of Barabbas out of the Jew of Malta kind of villain than the kind of more rounded or theologically sensitive version that some people might want. But no, I mean, basically, the expulsion of the Jews from England, and this is kind of why I'm reluctant to say that Shakespeare needed the House of Converts to know Jews. When the Jews are expelled from England in 1290, it doesn't stop people representing them. In fact, they start representing them more and more fantastically and more viciously. Without Jews here, they actually become able to be whatever the Christian audience wants them to be. So actually not having much reality there is, not a problem for the imagination and for a writer like Shakespeare. So if if you think about The Tempest, he represents the New World, but we don't demand that he'd been there. He'd heard about it through reports and he'd heard about it through travel writing. And that's kind of similar to... Which
exploration, I think, does lend itself to challenging of personal interactions with travelers. Like, they'll think that Jews are one way, and then they travel to places like Italy or the city of Venice, where there was a very large Jewish community.
Yep.
And that travel revealed inconsistencies with the narratives at home in England about what Jews were supposed to be. And while Merchant of Venice is Shakespeare's most overtly Jewish play, there are mentions of Jews in Macbeth, Two Gentlemen of Verona, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Love, Labour's Lost, and Henry IV, Part 1. With the exception of Merchant, the other references use the word Jew as an insult, as a slur. But then in Merchant of Venice, there are many places which extol the virtues of a Jew. Is the play Merchant of Venice an example of how opinions in England about the Jews was changing during Shakespeare's lifetime?
It's really hard to say because the actual quantity of material we've got is quite small. There are travellers from this time, English travellers. One of them, for example, Andrew Boord, who's from slightly earlier than Shakespeare, from the early 16th century. He travels around Europe and he actually visits he witnesses various Jewish communities. And there's another traveller, Richard Torkington, from the early 16th century, who watches a Jewish wedding in Corfu. And as you say, they're quite surprised at what they see from real Jews versus what they had been taught to see. Was the Jewish image changing around this time? Shylock is an unusually sophisticated and ambiguous representation of a Jew. That's what I think. I think there's not that much more to say than that. But I don't think you can also find extremely simplistic and negative representations of Jews from the same time. So I wouldn't want to say exactly.
Well, we can stick with ambiguous. That's fine. You referred to the 1290 expulsion of the Jews, but that expulsion has been blamed by some 17th century writers for what was known as Scotland's opposition to pork and their close-fistedness specifically. This expulsion of the Jews was not unique to the past or even the 13th century, because in Shakespeare's lifetime in 1607, Sir Thomas Shirley would urge James I to expel the Jews again. Given the association between Scotland and the expulsion of the Jews in the 13th century, how did this request go over with the Scottish king?
This is a kind of myth. This is there was no real Jewish community in Scotland. So this is political rhetoric. This is inventing an enemy. This is using the Jews as a political football.
So just to pull the facts out of this myth, did Sir Thomas Shirley actually go to James I with this request to expel the Jews, or was that a myth as well?
That's reported in a much later text by Thomas Harrington. But yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, like you said about the myth of Scottish, was it closed-fistedness, you said?
I did, yes.
So this is using Jews and Judaism as a kind of political insult and as a political football, not as an actual policy. But you are quite right in saying that the 1290 expulsion from England was actually the first national expulsion. There were multiple expulsions. In 1492, there was the huge catastrophic expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal. And Jews being moved and being allowed, and talking about Venice, you have the ghetto there. So the Jews being moved, constrained, expelled. This is something which is very much present in Shakespeare's time. But the Scotland stuff is all a bit of a myth.
We would love to explore this topic further and to learn more about the Jews in Shakespeare's time and what they were doing in England. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we should check out to learn more?
Well, I mean, I suppose the Merchant of Venice is, I think, an amazingly ambiguous and sophisticated play. And it's about so much more than Jews and Christians, but that's really a central theme of the whole play. So it's about contact between people. It's about debt. It's about proximity. It's about blood. It's not about separation. It's about similarity. And that's the main thing. So it's actually a great play for thinking about the meaning of what it's like to be like someone else, not to be unlike someone else. And that topic of blood, my daughter is my flesh and blood, Shylock says, and Jessica says, I'm a daughter to his blood. And the idea of what it means to be related to someone, to be like someone, does Jessica break the bloodline? It's really ambiguous about what happens to her. And actually, of course, we mustn't forget that the Merchant of Venice is Antonio, not Shylock. So, Shylock becomes the kind of main famous character, but he's not the merchant. It's a Christian merchant that is really the play's subject. So anyway, what am I talking about? What I would say is a great way of exploring this is to watch different productions of The Merchant of Venice. There's a lot you can find online. There have been many films of it. There's the famous Al Pacino film from a few years ago.
If I could wave flags right now and cheer that you're suggesting a great way to do this is to go to productions, I'm waving my flags over here. Yay for that.
Al Pacino, the film is very good. But you might also then challenge that. There's a silent film version from 1923 from Germany, which I think you can get online very easily. There's a Maori version from New Zealand from about 10, 15 years ago. The Merchant of Venice was very popular in the Yiddish theatre in New York and London in the early 20th century. So watching different versions of it is a great way of bringing out that ambiguity, seeing how different directors and different actors play Shylock, play Antonio. Is Antonio the villain of the play? Is Portia the villain of the play? There's so much that can be unpacked. So I think that's one answer about where to take it further. I'd also say to look at some of if you wanted to find out more about it, James Shapiro's book, Shakespeare and the Jews, is a great place to start thinking about this. There's a wonderful recent book by a scholar called Kathy Levetzo called The Accommodated Jew, which traces the way Jews are imagined from the the early Middle Ages right through to Milton, and so constructs a long kind of history of the representation of Jews. And exploring those kinds of cultural contexts is really useful and would repay a lot of, further reading.
Those are excellent resources. We will link to those as well as the film versions of Merchant of Venice in the show notes for today's episode. Anthony, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, mine is a slightly unusual choice. It would probably be The Book of Margery Kempe. This is a book I've done a lot of work on and translated. And Margery Kempe was a 15th century English woman who went to Jerusalem and Rome and Spain and all over the place. And she had visions of Christ and conversations with God. And she actually married God in Rome. And she had 14 children. And it's the first autobiography in English. And it's a real kind of encyclopedia of 15th century England. And I find it just one of those books you can go back to and back to and back to and find new things each time. And that, like Shakespeare or like the Bible, that's to me a hallmark of a great piece of literature, that you keep on seeing things that you've never seen before. So I think Margery Kempe.
Just with that very brief description, I think I'm already interested and have a ton of questions. So excellent choice for your...
Kempe. She's amazing.
You'll be well set up on your deserted island. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, there's a few things. I'm working on Margery Kempe, which is part of a much bigger project on English pilgrims in the later Middle Ages and from the 14th to the 16th century, and English pilgrims to Jerusalem and what they thought when they went to the Holy Land, what they found there, the encounters they had there, what they were reading, what they wrote when they came back, and so how they constructed that. And actually Venice is very important for that because most of the pilgrims went via Venice. And the other thing which is actually connected to this topic, at the moment there's an exhibition on at the Jewish Museum in London, which is on the theme of Jews, money and myth. And Shylock appears in this exhibition in a few different places. And this exhibition runs until October. And this has been really exciting working on this topic, which is really about the representation of Jews and money and positive, negative, and ambiguous representations that are right from the biblical period to the present day. And thinking about how we can take that exhibition further and other activities coming out of that is something on my radar at the moment.
Excellent. Well, this is all very exciting stuff. We'll look forward to seeing your next project and watching those as they develop, because I know we'll want to be checking them out. Thank you so much, Anthony Bale, for being here today and sharing with us the Jewish history from Shakespeare's lifetime. This has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To join in on this conversation with your thoughts about Jews in Shakespeare's England, be sure to check out today's show notes. I have links there where you can watch online many of the various productions of Merchant of Venice that you can watch for free. I've curated the best places for you and linked to that in the show notes. And there are also links to extra history and all of the excellent resources Anthony recommends when you want to learn more about what it was like to be Jewish during Shakespeare's lifetime. Find all of these things in the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 85. That's CassidyCash.com/EP85. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.